Hi, everyone. I want to talk to you today about infrastructure and the infrastructure plans that everyone seems to be talking about these days. The specific context that I want to discuss infrastructure in with you is eminent domain, how eminent domain plays into the infrastructure plans, and what the implications of the infrastructure plans will have in that area of eminent domain. So I've titled our presentation today, What's Coming and What Businesses Should Do About It. Before digging into the substance, I want to talk a little bit about our eminent domain practice at Retzel and Andrus. We have an extensive eminent domain practice with going back many years. Our expertise and experience includes representing both property owners and commercial tenants, as well as condemning or appropriating authorities. In fact, the fact that we've represented condemning authorities as much as we have really makes us unique in terms of the practitioners in this space, most of whom are exclusively or almost exclusively property owner side. We do the property owner side work, of course, and that's a focus, but having that perspective really gives us a competitive advantage in terms of working through these cases. On the property owner side, we've represented businesses of every size and type. Among those, just to name a few, some of the nation's largest gas stations, retail pharmacies, auto parts stores, grocery stores, and discount retailers. And then on the condemning authority side, we've represented some of the nation's largest electric utility companies, as well as pipeline companies when we are actually acquiring the property. And the practice at Retzel is primarily Ohio, but it really gets into nationwide or at least regional representations on a regular basis. So infrastructure, that's the hot topic these days. And the political debate over this issue is in the news almost every day. I'm sure most of you have probably been at least seeing it, if not following it. There are some areas that where the politicians agree on, which in and of itself is a rare thing in the climate we live in. And those are that, some increased federal spending on infrastructure is necessary, at least with respect to certain areas. And those areas consist of roads, bridges, public transit, railroads, water storage, ports and airports, inland waterways, broadband infrastructure, and drinking and wastewater infrastructure. Beyond those areas of agreement, though, areas of sharp disagreement abound. So the parties disagree on whether infrastructure should include other areas of investment proposed by Democrats, including primarily what's been termed human infrastructure, things like the care economy, job training, and things of that nature, research and development. The parties also disagree on how to spend, how much to spend on infrastructure improvements. And beyond that, they disagree on how to pay for that spending for these improvements. So what we have is two competing plans that have been proposed by each party. On the Democratic side, you have President Biden's American Jobs Plan, or AJP, as I'll refer to it at points in this presentation. And then on the other side, you've got Senate Republicans with their Republican roadmap. But before getting into those competing plans, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork, and it relates to the COVID-19 relief packages that Congress passed, and there were 3 of them over the last year or so. The first was in 2020. It was the CARES Act, and it provided $25 billion in funding to support the transit industry, among many other things. But the transit industry was given money to deal with the impact of the pandemic. And as of the latest figures I've been able to find on that, which is March of this year, 69% of those funds are dispersed, leaving obviously a large percentage that has not yet been dispersed. And then there was the 2021 Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act. And similar to the CARES Act, it set aside $14 billion to support the transit industry. And as of March of this year, none of that money had yet been dispersed. And actually, the Department of the Treasury is just now in the process of finalizing and implementing the grants program for local governments and tribal governments to apply for some of those funds. And then earlier this year, after the Biden administration took office, there was the American Rescue Plan Act, which was provided for $350 billion in emergency funding for eligible state, local, territorial, and tribal governments. Of that amount, $30.5 billion was once again for the transit industry. And interestingly, $1.675 billion of that amount was specifically allocated to capital investments, which sort of looks like the tip of the infrastructure iceberg in this congressional period. Now we have the American Jobs Plan, which of course is President Biden's signature infrastructure package proposal, which is available on our fact sheet relating to the plan is available on the White House's website. It's quite voluminous, whereas the Republican roadmap is, I think, a 2-page document. So even the proposals differ starkly. But just giving you a high-level overview of the AJP, I'm not going to try to summarize every provision because that would be boring and too time-consuming. But I am going to hit on the subjects that implicate the use of eminent domain. The American Jobs Plan sets aside $621 billion for transportation infrastructure and resilience. And that umbrella amount is broken down into a bunch of different buckets, which I'm going to talk about. The first is $115 billion to modernize bridges, highways, and roads. And the focus there is primarily on the 10 most economically significant bridges in the country that are in need of significant repair or reconstruction. And then 10,000 smaller bridges in the greatest disrepair. And there's then 20,000 miles of other roads with significant repair needs identified to be covered by that money. Then you have $25 billion for sort of a vague category, and that is ambitious projects that have tangible benefits to the regional or national economy, but are too large or complex for existing funding programs. Then you have $20 billion to reconnect neighborhoods cut off by historic transportation investments, another $85 billion to modernize and expand public transit, which of course they've already been getting some money from the COVID relief packages, and then $80 billion for Amtrak, and the priorities there are to repair or to tend to the repair backlog. A lot of deferred maintenance has been waiting in the Amtrak system. And then the heavily traveled Northeast corridor is in need of modernization. And then, and interestingly for folks where I am in Ohio, part of that money is to improve existing corridors and to connect new city pairs. And the current proposal that Amtrak has put out would include connecting Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati on an Amtrak line, which is pretty interesting and exciting for Ohio. And then part of that transportation money is $25 billion for airports, $17 billion for waterways, coastal ports, land ports of entry, and ferries. And then there are other amounts that don't relate to transportation, but also implicate the use of eminent domain, because these are things that are considered public purpose or would be considered public purposes by a court that would justify the exercise of eminent domain. There's $100 billion for high-speed broadband, another $100 billion for power grid modernization and resiliency, and then 100 billion, to upgrade and build new public schools. $12 billion for community colleges, and that includes the building of new facilities, and 111 billion to upgrade and modernize drinking and wastewater infrastructure, which of course the drinking water where that's been most in the news over the last couple of years is certainly Flint, Michigan, but it occurs in other places around the country as well. So that's the American Jobs Plan in a nutshell. And then on the other side, you have the Republican roadmap. And it differs from the AJP in some significant ways. First of all, it has a more limited definition of infrastructure that tracks with what I talked about at the beginning of the presentation in terms of the areas of agreement between the parties. But those categories still implicate the use of eminent domain, so I want to talk about them. The Republican roadmap also significantly narrows the sectors that would receive infrastructure funds. And if you just look at the numbers, the comparison is 75% less overall than the AJP. On transportation, there's 29% less devoted than the AJP. And the primary reason for that is that whereas the AJP provides funding for electric vehicles, the Republican roadmap does not. And then as far as public transit is concerned, the Republicans are proposing 28% less. As far as rail goes, they're proposing 75% less. Now on roads and bridges, it's a little bit different. They're proposing 160% more than the American Jobs Plan. And the same is true with respect to airports, 76% more. But those numbers don't really tell the whole story, because whereas the American Jobs Plan proposes new money on top of allocations that are already being made, the Republican roadmap generally adjusts funding that's already programmed up slightly. So it's counting, some people are counting those pre-programmed funds towards these overall numbers that were the basis for the comparisons I just drew. So it's not a completely apples to apples comparison. Now, on the Republican roadmap, in terms of the what it actually sets forth, for transportation infrastructure, it provides $454 billion. Of that amount, you've got $299 billion for roads and bridges, $61 billion for public transit systems, $44 billion for airports, $20 billion for rail, $17 billion for ports and inland waterways, $13 billion for safety programs. And then you have, outside of transportation, the broadband infrastructure, for which the Republicans are proposing $65 billion. And then you have the water infrastructure, a total of $49 billion to be divided between drinking and wastewater systems, that's $35 billion, and then $14 billion for water storage. And then also jumping into the mix is the Problem Solvers Caucus, and they've developed a series of recommendations on infrastructure. And in case you're wondering, the Problem Solvers Caucus is a 56-member bipartisan group of U.S. representatives, and their goal is to foster bipartisan cooperation. So you have Democrats and Republicans in that caucus. And that caucus, like the American Jobs Plan and the Republican roadmap, recognizes the dire need to rebuild and responsibly invest in infrastructure. And their report sets forth policy recommendations to improve many of the same subjects: highways, roads, bridges, energy systems, the power grid, items that we've already discussed that are covered in the two competing plans that are out there right now. And the stated goal of the recommendations is to provide sustainable long-term funding for infrastructure without income tax increases. And while that's not the focus of my presentation, anybody following this issue knows that whether or not to increase taxes to pay for these infrastructure improvements is the number one divisive issue, with Republicans not wanting to increase taxes at all, and the Democrats wanting to increase them somewhat significantly. So the problem solvers look to increasing IRS enforcement of the current tax laws, leveraging public-private partnerships, and bolstering the Highway Trust Fund, which has been losing money year over year for some time now. And that's not to say that some of these policy recommendations aren't already in one or the other of the primary plans. I know for a fact that the increased IRS enforcement is a component of the American Jobs Plan, but that's what the Problem Solvers Caucus is choosing to focus on. And the other interesting thing about the Problem Solvers Caucus recommendations is while it sets forth policy solutions, it does not specify any specific amounts for infrastructure spending. But it's clear that the intent of that document is for the spending to be far greater than what has historically been devoted to infrastructure. So what does all this mean? My take and Retzel's take is that we've got a lot of movement and a lot of momentum for some form of infrastructure package, and that's going to devote a lot more money in one way or another than has been devoted to these projects in the past. Now, what is it actually going to look like when Congress gets around to passing something? Who knows? From what I can gather, it seems as though there's a potential that the parties might negotiate a bipartisan bill. Here we are in the last week of May of 2021. The chances of that, if you follow the news, are looking increasingly slim. However, there is also some speculation that the portions of the American Jobs Plan that both parties agree on may be passed in a bipartisan manner. And then Democrats may, and they're actually expected, to attempt to pass the remainder of the plan or some version of it that the entire party can agree on through the budget reconciliation process. And if you're not familiar, the budget reconciliation process would bypass the filibuster in the Senate, and it would permit passage of a bill with only 51 votes in the Senate, which if every Democrat jumped on board, they would have those votes. Now, usually the budget reconciliation process is only available once a year. However, the U.S. Senate parliamentarian, which is in charge of determining when those procedures can be used, has authorized that it be used again, even though it was just used earlier this year to pass the American Rescue Plan Act along party lines. And there is the potential, although it may be a little unrealistic, that this is going to move fairly quickly through Congress. I know that President Biden set an unofficial deadline of Memorial Day to try to reach a bipartisan agreement on an overall package, which is just a few days away. And then Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, has also announced that she would like to see a package passed the House by the 4th of July holiday. So, changes to infrastructure are imminent, and to play on words, also imminent is an increase in eminent domain. So, once this bill passes in whatever form it's in, money's going to start to flow, and projects are going to start to move. What we're going to see likely is a significant increase in construction activity across the country, and that's going to lead to a significant increase as well in the use of eminent domain to acquire the necessary property rights to accomplish these projects. And what we're finding in representing the businesses that we do, and there are quite a few, is that for the most part, businesses are not ready for this onslaught that's likely coming down the pike. Most businesses do not devote a lot of resources to eminent domain, which is completely understandable and justified because, after all, in the life cycle of a typical business, how often does eminent domain become an issue? Not all that often. I guess there's an exception to that if you're a very large brick and mortar retailer or something along those lines with lots of locations along roads, for example, that are significantly traveled and are subject to repeated improvements. That at any given time you're dealing with several eminent domain projects. But smaller businesses, it's an extraordinary situation, and the business folks don't concern themselves with that. And then for businesses that do have in-house legal departments, by and large, what we find is they don't pay a lot of attention to eminent domain either. First of all, they're busy, in many cases as busy as the business folks, and they don't have time to deal with this stuff. And then you also have a mentality in a business structure. Legal is seen as a cost center, not it doesn't produce revenue. And eminent domain is not seen as a cost. It's not viewed as a true cost because you don't have money actually being potentially paid out in claims to third parties. So there's a built-in disincentive for an in-house legal department to prioritize eminent domain because it's not going to show up on a balance sheet as a negative, because at some point, some amount of money is actually going to be coming into the business as a result of taking. So it's treated as found money, and people don't really know, they don't really pay much attention to it, and they don't either try to challenge a taking typically, nor do they work very hard to maximize recovery. In this area, if you're going to maximize recovery, you need to be willing to put up the costs to get an appraisal, which can be several thousands of dollars. That would be viewed as a true cost and an outlay by the business that someone who has someone looking over their shoulder on the budget may say, let's just try to negotiate for a little bit more than what the condemning authority has offered, and just go with that. Now, some businesses are savvy enough or sophisticated enough to utilize outside real estate counsel on a regular basis, which is a great thing to do. And the problem with relying on the outside real estate lawyers for eminent domain is that eminent domain is real estate litigation. Most real estate lawyers are transactional in nature as far as the practice is concerned. Eminent domain, in addition to being litigation, is a niche practice area. It requires a specialized skill set that even a lot of trained litigators don't have. So it really is a specialized area that requires specialized skills. And as a result of these businesses using or not devoting the attention to eminent domain that it could be given, is that a lot of times matters fall through the cracks. You may have lawsuits filed where just nobody responds, or maybe notice of the lawsuit goes to one place, but it doesn't get routed to where it needs to be for someone who might respond to pay attention to it. And the consequences of this are significant. When that happens, what ends up happening is that the condemning authority's version of what the property is worth becomes what the property is valued at, and you don't have any voice by the property owner saying, "Hey, no, this property is actually more valuable than they want to acknowledge." And that, in a nutshell, is the nature of our adversarial justice system generally, and certainly in the eminent domain realm. That's what makes the system work. You have both sides advocating for competing valuations with their experts, appraisers, and then the jury, as the decision-making body, determines whether one or the other is correct, or if the real value is somewhere in between. So if you don't have the property owner participating in the process, you often have significant money being left on the table. Okay, so it's time to change the way the businesses think about eminent domain. And the change can be different based on the kind of business you have, of course. So for large brick and mortar retailers, which are the ones who are most likely to be impacted by these changes, we recommend that they audit how eminent domain matters are handled currently. Look at things like who receives notices from the condemnors or the appropriating authorities. What happens once that notice is received? Does it just sit on someone's desk collecting dust, or does it get routed to someone who's actually going to give it some attention? Or does it depend on who gets it and what particular stuff is happening on the day it's received? And if the result of that audit is that the response is not consistent across the enterprise, then it makes sense to systematize it and train your personnel on how to follow the protocol that you put into place. And doing this, if it's something that doesn't seem clear to the business, you can't really go wrong in consulting with a qualified eminent domain lawyer who can give you some tips on what you should be doing and how you should be going about doing it. Now, for smaller businesses, it may not make sense to do all that, but it still makes sense to designate a point person within the organization who's going to deal with these issues and formulate a response plan ahead of time so that when you are hit with an eminent domain situation, you're not trying to create the wheel at that point. Now, all businesses, regardless of size, like I said, should consider lining up qualified eminent domain counsel ahead of time. In many states, including where I practice primarily in Ohio, a condemnor can file an eminent domain lawsuit shortly after sending written notice to the property owner, which formally communicates its intent to acquire the property. In Ohio, it's 30 days. You receive that notice, and within 30 days, the condemning authority can file a lawsuit. And then you have a very limited amount of time after that to raise certain challenges to the taking, which if you don't timely raise them, they're lost. And in Ohio, eminent domain matters are prioritized among all other matters, I think subject only to criminal issues, and they're advanced as a matter of immediate public interest. So whereas in a typical case, you may have a piece of litigation going through the courts for two or more years, an eminent domain case can move remarkably quickly. And in fact, if you look at the statutory framework in Ohio, we're talking a matter of weeks and months, not years, to get to a jury determination of the valuation. So it may be difficult based on the circumstances to complete an appropriate search for counsel in the limited amount of time that you'll have once you're actually hit with notice or even worse, a lawsuit. And if you don't take action, you risk losing your rights. In Ohio, as elsewhere, if you don't, if you think you might have a defense to the taking itself, and to be able to stop the taking, that it's not necessary or the appropriate authority somehow lacks the legal right to do it, which is not a typical situation, but it certainly happens. If you don't timely raise that and do so in the appropriate manner as required by the statute and the interpreting case law, which can be a trap for the uninitiated, you lose those challenges, and then you're just down to talking about money. Whereas, and you're stuck with a project that may ultimately kill the business. Whereas if you had taken timely action, you could fight to try to save the business. But even beyond that, and I don't want to suggest that that's the normal situation. Normally, challenges to the taking are not appropriate or would fail, and we don't recommend them for that reason. But you're still dealing with money, and make no mistake, it is the business's money that's at stake. It shouldn't be viewed as found money and not a cost or a true cost, because it is a true cost. It's the value of your real estate assets being diminished. And if and when you ever decide to sell those assets, you're going to get less for them than you put into them because of the diminution in value caused by the taking. And even beyond that, you may have trouble operating on a site after it's been the subject of a taking, and not just if it's a total taking. Sometimes even a partial taking that leaves the building's intact, for example, can still be severe enough on operations to require a business to close. So that's the presentation. I've included my contact information here. If anyone has any questions about these or any other infrastructure or eminent domain questions, I invite you to contact me at any time. Thank you so much for your attention.